Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We have a lot of people on the line, which really speaks to how important the topic of loan forgiveness, as it's defined in the Paycheck Protection Program, is to all of you. It's hard to believe that within a few days, we have clients whose loans will become eligible to apply to have some, if not all, of their PPP loan forgiven. Watching this program unfold over a very short period of time has been truly amazing and somewhat historic. Now, the program, as well as the rollout of the program, has not been perfect. In fact, at times, it's been bumpy and really frustrating. But despite all that, the program has delivered billions of dollars to companies throughout this country over the last couple of months. Now, some of you may have seen the statistics as they have been in the news, but in 2019, the SBA, Small Business Administration, made 58,000 loans for just over $28 billion. Those are big numbers, a lot of money going out the door. But by contrast, since the beginning of April, there have been almost 4.5 million loans approved, totaling over $510 billion. Can you imagine trying to manage that level of growth in your business in such a short period of time? The numbers are really impressive, and it's not surprising that there's been some bumps along the way. At Alerus, we are really proud of the fact that we were able to help over 1,500 clients obtain nearly $360 million in PPP funds. Like the SBA, never before have we originated that volume of loans in such a short period of time. I am incredibly proud of all of our teams that worked long hours and many weekends to make that happen. Rest assured, you have a lot of really dedicated individuals here at Alerus that are committed to helping your business during these very challenging times. Over the last couple of months, we've seen this program evolve, and I expect that we will continue to see changes in the program as we work through the forgiveness process. In fact, as recently as last night, there was a bill approved by the Senate that has a number of changes to this process. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to touch on those proposed changes, while not yet fully approved, are being considered, and I do expect will become part of the PPP program and forgiveness process. We have a lot to cover today, so I do want to jump into the presentation. As Mary indicated, with me is Carrie Metz. Carrie has been instrumental in rolling out this program for us, and she'll be helping me with some of the more technical questions that you may have. So with that, we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to start out at the very basic, that in order for you to get your loan forgiven, you will need to complete and submit the SBA application. Now, we're going to try to help you with this process, and we'll be sending out that application to you. Now, I'm not going to walk through the application in detail today or in its entirety, but what I'm hoping to provide to you is an understanding of key terms, requirements, and to clarify some areas of the application. So what does the timing look like for this process? So once you get your application from Alerus and you fill out that application and return it to us, we have 60 days to issue a decision on that application and let you know what amount you've been approved for forgiveness. Once we've done that process, we'll go ahead and submit it to the SBA. And once we've submitted that application to the SBA, they have 90 days to review the request for loan forgiveness, to remit the payment back to the bank, and that will include any accrued interest on that loan through the date of payment. Now, one of the things I want to touch on is we do need to make sure that when you submit an application to the bank for your loan forgiveness, we want that to be a complete application. And what I mean by complete is we want to make sure that that application is filled out in its entirety. It has the loan calculator as well as the supporting documents that we need. If we get that application in and are missing some information, then your advisor is going to be reaching out to you, letting you know what we're still missing to make sure we get that complete packet in. Now, I want to touch on just briefly the application process. So there's a couple of options for the eligibility period, and we're going to talk through that in just a minute. As the rules stand today, right now, you are eligible to apply for forgiveness after the 8-week eligibility period. And again, we're going to touch on what that eligibility period is in just 1 minute. You will receive a communication from your advisor here at Alerus, and they will be sending out to you an application for your forgiveness piece. Once you've received that communication from your advisor, you're going to have to go ahead, complete that application as well as a calculator, and return both of those back to the bank. Gary, if we can move ahead to the next slide. One of the things that we're going to try to do is we're going to try to help you as much as we can with this application process. So when you receive your application for forgiveness that we're going to send you from Alerus, we're going to try to fill out that application with as much information as we can. So some of the things that we will include in that pre-filled application is we'll pre-fill it with your name and address, and then other items such as loan number, loan amount, as well as the disbursement date. Once you have that, you're going to need to complete the remaining fields and then calculate the amount eligible for loan forgiveness. And it's important to understand that you are going to be the ones calculating the amount that you're eligible for forgiveness. That's not something that the bank is going to do. Now, we are required by the SBA to review that calculation and to review the supporting documentation that you send in to make sure that that looks reasonable and appropriate, but you're the ones that are really going to be making that calculation and that determination. The other item that I want to touch on as far as the application is you will note when you get the application, one of the things they're going to ask you about is, did you receive an economic injury disaster loan? If you did, simply note that on the application and provide the application number per the instructions, and then the SBA will take that into consideration when making the determination for your loan forgiveness amount. Now, one of the things that is important to understand is the covered period. And again, everything I'm speaking to is how the rules are today. There's potentially some changes coming to this, which we'll touch on the end. But right now, there's two options for you for the covered period. The first option is 8 weeks or 56 days from the date of loan disbursement. And that is the date in which you would have received your loan funds. The other thing that the SBA did is they created, and you'll see this on the application, what they refer to as an alternative payroll covered period. And what that means is if you would have gotten your loan disbursed and those funds on, say, a Tuesday, but you would have had a new payroll period starting that next Sunday, what the SBA says is you can start that 8-week period or those 56 days with the start of that payroll period if you choose to do that. And a lot of companies may want to think about doing that because it may align easier with their reporting and the supporting documentation that you would need to provide. Now that we've talked about the covered period, I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what can be eligible to help you determine that amount for forgiveness. So there's a number of things that you can take into consideration. And when we refer to covered expenses, and that's a term you're going to see in the application, that's a term you're going to hear from the SBA, all covered expenses mean is simply items that count toward the amount that you can have forgiven. So when I refer to covered, that's all it means, is what are the expenses that count toward forgiveness. Now, the biggest thing is payroll. And the payroll calculation has not changed except for a couple of small items that I'm going to touch on. But overall, the rules that you used when you were applying for your loan to determine that payroll amount are the same exact rules that you are going to be following when you request your PPP loan be forgiven. And so the things that you can take into consideration are things like compensation, salary, wages, commissions, things like tips, all can count towards that amount. Now, like we saw in the first phase in the application process when you applied for the loan, there is a limit of $100,000 on cash compensation. So effectively what you need to take a look at is what that 8-week equivalent is, which is $15,385, and that's the maximum that can be claimed for any one individual employee. Other types of things that you can factor into the payroll calculation, like in the first phase, are things like payments for vacation, parental, family, medical, and sick leave, as well as benefits such as group health coverage or retirement benefits that you provide to your employees, and state and local taxes. Now, one of the things that is new in this particular round pertains to any hazard pay or bonuses that you may have provided to your employees. So if you've had employees that have been coming into work in this current period of time and under the current situation, and you chose to pay them additional salary in order to compensate for them coming in, that is eligible under the PPP rules for forgiveness, as are any type of bonuses that you would have provided for those same reasons. So the other area that you can factor in as part of your forgiveness calculation would be some non-payroll costs. And those non-payroll costs really consist of three different items: any mortgage interest, as well as any rent or utility payments that you have paid during the covered period. Now, a couple of other things that I want to note are if you have been paying a furloughed employee, or if you have been employing employees, even though they're not working right now due to economic conditions or the current health situation, those amounts are eligible to be included in your forgiveness calculation. One of the other important things to understand, especially as it pertains to non-payroll costs, is any prepaid or accrued expenses cannot be included. So what the SBA is saying, you have to either have paid the item during your 8-week period and or incurred that expense. Now, if it's an incurred expense and you haven't paid it, what the SBA is saying is you need to pay that expense prior to the next payroll or payment date. So, for example, if your payroll ended before the 56-week period was, or 56-day period was up, and you had maybe 3 or 4 days of additional payroll within that 56-day period, you can go ahead and count that as long as those funds are paid with the next payroll period. But if you're thinking that you can maybe prepay some rent payments or make a principal pay down on your loan, those would be considered ineligible for purposes of calculating your forgiveness amount. One of the other things that I want to touch on pertains to self-employed individuals. So the rules for self-employed are going to basically follow the rules for all employees with just a couple of exceptions. So as we talked about, there is the limit of $100,000 for payroll costs. And then for self-employed and partnerships, you can include covered benefits as long as the total cap of $100,000 is not exceeded. If you, with those benefits, would exceed that $100,000 cap, then those are not eligible to be included in the calculation. Now, specifically with owner's compensation, to make that determination, what the SBA is requiring is that you need to go back and look at 2019 net profit, and then essentially look at what 8 weeks worth of that 2019 profit is, and that's the amount that you're going to use for forgiveness. In addition, you can take a look at things like mortgage, interest, rent or utility payments to the extent that you can deduct them on Form 1040 Schedule C. Similar to owner's compensation, general partner compensation is going to be determined based on 2019 net earnings, and you're going to use the K-1 statements to make that determination, as well as some of those applicable deductions as noted on the slide. This should also be detailed in the instructions for you. So now that we've talked about how to figure out what your total amount of eligibility is for forgiveness based on your payroll costs and eligible expenses, what are some things that might impact that amount that can be forgiven? So there's two things that can impact them. The first thing is a reduction in FTE employees. So there's a couple of things that are important to note as we look at this first requirement that that forgivable amount may be impacted by FTE employee reduction. One of the things that you're going to need to do is take a look at what the SBA refers to as a reference period. And so under the regulations, you have two options for what your reference period is. So the period that you select can be either between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th of 2019, or January 1st, 2020 and February 29th, 2020. My recommendation to you is that you take a look at both of those periods and pick the period that has the higher number of FTEs for your business. Now, the other thing that the SBA allows is that there's two options to determine what that FTE calculation looks like. So the first method, method one, I think is probably the more traditional calculation for FTE. And what the SBA is saying is that you want to take the average number of hours that you paid per week for your employees and divide that by 40. So if your employee worked 40 hours divided by 40, that's a 1 FTE. Now, one thing I do want to make note of is in a lot of times, FTE can be considered anyone who works 36 hours or more, but for purposes of SBA and the forgiveness calculation, SBA is using 40 hours. Now, if you would have, say, an employee that worked 32 hours, again, divided by 40, that would be a 0.8 FTE. So what you're going to need to do is determine what your FTE calculation is for the covered period, as well as your 2 reference period. Now, the other method that you can use is what the SBA is referring to as a simplified method. So what that means is simply if you have an employee that is working at least 40 hours or more per week, you can assign a 1 FTE to them. And then any employee that works less than 40 hours, you need to assign a 0.5. Again, my recommendation would be take a look at both options and pick whichever number is the more beneficial number for you in making this determination. What the SBA is going to do is they're going to compare the number of FTEs. They're going to have you compare the number of FTEs during the 56-day period or that 8-week period, and then compare it to that reference period that you selected. And if there's been any reduction in FTE, then they're going to require that you reduce your forgiveness amount by that amount. So, for example, if your FTEs during the reference period were 20, but your number of employees during the covered period of 8 weeks is 18, that's a 10% reduction in workforce and possibly a 10% reduction in the amount that you're eligible for forgiveness. Now, it's really important to note that if your business had FTE reductions due to an employee that was fired for cause, voluntarily resigns, or voluntarily requests a scheduled reduction, you do not need to, the SBA is not going to penalize you for that. So you don't need to include that in your FTE calculation, but be sure to maintain documentation if that's the situation. The other thing that is not going to penalize you from an FTE calculation standpoint is if you have offered to rehire an individual, but the employee has declined the offer, the forgiveness amount will not be impacted. Really important that you maintain documentation if this is a situation that is applicable to you. I do expect we'll see more guidance on this, as well as some guidance that's going to indicate that in those situations, they would look for you to provide a notice to the state employment office as far as your offer of rehiring back to that employee. Now, the second item that could potentially impact the forgiveness amount is if there is a reduction in wages. So what the SBA wants to understand is, did you reduce salaries by more than 25%? Now, the application does provide guidance on it, but at least to me, the instructions that were provided felt a little confusing. So what I want to do is really walk you through a couple of examples of what that calculation looks like. So what the SBA is going to say, and what they want to know is, did you reduce salaries by more than 25%? So in the example that is up on the slide, if salaries and wages during that 56-day or 8-week period for an individual employee was $12,000, you're going to want to note that. And then what the SBA wants you to do is to compare that to what that employee's salaries and wages were between January 1st and March 31st. So if that was $15,000, then you're going to compare the two, and effectively that employee is still being paid at 80%. There's no deduction required. Now, if we go to the next slide, we're going to walk through an example of where the forgiveness amount would be impacted. So in this case, the compensation to the employee during the covered period was $10,000. But during the reference period that the SBA wants you to take a look at, that employee's compensation was $15,000. If we divide line 1 by line 2, it's going to give us a 0.66, indicating that the salary was reduced by more than that 25% threshold that is allowed by the SBA. So then what the SBA is going to ask you to do is to take the amount of wages during that reference period, multiply it by 0.75 to determine what that baseline of 75% of the salary was. And in this case, it's $11,250. And then also take what that period was during the covered period, or $10,000, and then calculate the difference. So in this case, the difference is $1,250, and that is the amount that the SBA would look for the loan forgiveness amount to be reduced. So what the SBA application is going to ask you to do is to do both those calculations that we talked about, both making a determination if there was an FTE reduction, as well as making a determination if salaries and wages were reduced by more than 25%. Both items could potentially impact the amount of forgiveness that you're entitled to. Now, there are some things that can offset that reduction, and one of the things that can do that I'm going to refer to as the safe harbor provision. So what is the safe harbor provision, and what does that mean to you? So what that means is that if you have adjusted an employee's compensation, or if you reset the employee's compensation, or basically rehire people by June 30th, there is no reduction required. So what the SBA is saying is that even if you needed to reduce wages during this period of time, in this 8-week cover period, or if you laid off some employees, as long as you reinstate those wages or rehire those employees, then you do not need to take a deduction from the forgivable piece that you're potentially eligible for. Now, you will need to provide documentation as to this. So if this is a provision that you want to take advantage of, then you will need to wait until after June 30th to apply to have your loan forgiven. So we've talked about how to calculate the forgivable amount, and we've talked about some of the things that may impact that. But what do you need to do in order to document your calculations that you're going to be providing on the SBA application? So some of the things that you will need to provide to the bank as a verification of your payroll expenses include things like bank statements or third-party processing reports that document the compensation paid. Tax forms, Form 941, are types of things that you can supply to the bank to substantiate your calculations. For things like benefits, any documentation that you have pertaining to the payment of health insurance or retirement plans will need to be provided, as well as information if you're a sole proprietor or general partner. You're going to want to provide that 2019 Form 1040 Schedule C or the 2019 Schedule K1. So those are types of things that the bank is going to be looking for in order to verify your payroll application for forgiveness. You're also going to want to provide the documentation that you completed pertaining to FTE documentation. As far as documentation for some of the other expenses, such as mortgage interest, rent or lease payments, or utility payments, what you're going to want to do is include copies of any bank statements or account statements demonstrating that you actually incurred and paid those expenses during that covered period. For things like rent or lease payments, you can include a copy of a lease. And for things like utility payments, you could include copies of invoices, again, substantiating that you incurred and paid those expenses during that eligibility period. Now, a couple other things that are important to know as the application is today is if you received a PPP loan, if you had affiliate entities, the SBA wants to know if you received a loan over $2 million. So if you have a loan individually that was over $2 million in PPP financing, or if together with your affiliates it exceeded $2 million, the SBA wants you to note that on your application. The other thing is really make sure that you are carefully reading and initialing next to each certification. These are really important statements from the SBA's perspective, so take the time to read them, make sure you're understanding them, and make sure you're initialing each individual one. If we receive an application and you have not certified individually on each one of those, we will have to send it back to you to have you attest to those certifications. before we are able to process your loan. One of the other things that the SBA is requiring is that any PPP documents and records that you have used either for the loan application piece on the front end, as well as the loan forgiveness piece, you need to retain for 6 years from the date the loan has either been forgiven and or paid in full. Now, a couple of things I want to note, but I do want to qualify it to say I am not an accountant, I am not a tax expert, but there are a couple of things pertaining from a tax standpoint that I want you to be aware of and potentially make sure you're talking about with your accountant or your tax advisor. So by statute, any amount that you are eligible for forgiveness and get forgiven on your PPP loans are not taxable. Although the IRS did come out with what is referred to as Notice 2020-32, that does eliminate the deductibility of expenses that qualify for PPP loan forgiveness. So this does potentially impact your business from a tax standpoint and is something you want to be aware of and make sure you're talking about, again, with your accountant or your tax advisor. So, pending congressional changes. Now that we have just spent almost the last 30 minutes talking about all of the rules as they stand today, what could potentially change? And then to the extent that things could potentially change, what does that mean to you? Like we saw in the first phase, we tended to see changes and modifications to the program evolve as the SBA was rolling it out for the application piece. And as I mentioned, I fully expect we're going to see some of those changes with the forgiveness piece. As of last night, the Senate approved a bill that had previously been approved by the House and is now going to be sent to the President for signature. And this bill, this contains a number of changes, and we expect that once the bill has been signed by the President, the SBA will be incorporating these changes into the forgiveness process. So what are these changes and what's potentially pending that could impact your forgiveness? So one of the things that we just spent a lot of time talking about is the 8-week eligibility period. Well, incorporated into this bill that's in the process of being approved is that they are looking at extending that 8-week period up to 24 weeks. So what that means is if in the 8-week period you did not have enough expenses either from payroll, utilities, mortgage interest, or those items that we talked about as eligible expenses, what the government is saying is they're going to give you more time to incur those expenses and that you now have up to 24 weeks to incur those expenses. The other thing that the Congress is looking at changing is that that safe harbor deadline of June 30th to rehire workers is now going to be pushed back to December 31st. And then the other thing that the bill does is provide some additional exemptions from that FTE calculation. So if you are unable to rehire workers, you're not going to be penalized for that. If you are unable to hire similarly qualified individuals, you're going to be allowed to have an exemption for that. Or if you are unable to hire workers due to the fact that there's been government restrictions in place and or due to health requirements that need to be maintained, there's going to be an exemption for that as well. One of the other things that is pending as far as a change is the time frame in which to repay any amount that is not eligible for forgiveness. So currently, if your loan is not fully forgiven, you need to have the balance of that loan repaid within 2 years. That's going to be changed and pushed out to 5 years. So now one thing I do want to note on that is that change is not retroactive. All of the other things I'm talking about are retroactive. But in this situation, if you're in a situation in which your loan is not fully forgiven and you want to extend that repayment period from 2 years to 5 years, that is something that you're going to need to work with your Laris advisor on, and we'll be able to maintenance and make that change for you. Another change that's coming through Congress is they're going to reduce the requirement for payroll as a percentage of total expenses from 75% to 60%. So again, if if this is a beneficial exception for you, where maybe you didn't have as many payroll costs, but you had a lot more pertaining to mortgage interest payments or rent payments, this is something that may benefit you. And the other thing that the SBA is looking at doing, or that the government is change that's in process, is extending the deferral period. So right now, principal and interest payments are deferred for 6 months. What the government and the bill currently going through Congress right now says is that principal and interest payments will not be required as long as you have applied for forgiveness. So essentially what they're saying is that you're not going to be required to make payments on that loan as long as you have that forgiveness application pending. Now the other thing to take note of in that's contained in the House bill is that once your eligibility period is up, and it's either that 8-week period or that 24-week period, they're going to expect that you're going to apply for forgiveness within 10 months. If 10 months have gone by and you have not applied for forgiveness, then P&I payments will kick in on the loan. So lots of changes potentially pending. We do expect that this bill, once signed by the President, it's going to take a little bit of time for the SBA to incorporate these changes into the application and the calculator determination. So I mentioned early on that you will receive the application from your advisor, and we will start to get those applications out to you as soon as we get that revised application from the SBA yet. Unfortunately, I don't know the timing of that, but would hope it would be within the next couple of weeks for those of you that are potentially reaching the end of your 8-week period. The other thing I should note is you do have the option to still use that 8-week period. So I'm sure, frustrating, lots of changes. I'm sure you're wondering, what do I do now? And one of the things that I want to assure you is you have time. There's no set deadline right now for when you will need to apply for forgiveness. And it may benefit you to wait until after the end of the quarter, potentially for certainly recording requirements. And given the changes that, while not yet approved, look like they are going to be approved, I would recommend that you look at your individual situation. If your loan is eligible for forgiveness based on the original 8-week period and the 75% payroll requirement, and you have all the documentation ready, you may want to just go ahead and apply for forgiveness when you receive that application from your advisor. Now, if you're in a situation where you would benefit from some of these changes, you should probably wait, get all of the information, and hopefully maximize the amount that you're eligible for loan forgiveness. So next steps. As I mentioned, your application will be sent to you by your Alaris advisor. Once you have that application complete and signed, and again, please review it and make sure that it's fully filled out. All the required signers have signed that application. You're going to go ahead and submit that application and your supporting documentation to your Alaris advisor. Once it's received here at the bank, your advisor is going to provide your application to our underwriting group, and they're going to review that application to make sure that that supporting documentation matches your calculations for forgiveness. Now, if we have any questions pertaining to that application or your calculation, your Alaris advisor will be reaching out to you. The other thing we'll do is if we make a determination that maybe there were some ineligible expenses or there were some inaccuracies in that calculation and we are not able to forgive the full amount that you have applied for, we're going to provide you a written notice of that, and you will have 30 days in which to appeal that. Once we've completed that process and made a determination of forgiveness, we're going to submit that application, the calculator, and the forgiveness amount to the SBA. The other thing I want to make note of is the SBA has come out, and maybe you've seen it in the news, that they may review certain applications to ensure that the eligibility requirements were met. If we do get a notice from the SBA that a file has been selected for review, we will notify you within 5 business days. So Carrie, if we want to go to the next slide. So hopefully I have not confused everyone too much, and that gives you some sense of an overview as far as what to expect in the forgiveness process. Clearly, there's more changes coming, and we'll continue to try to update you and provide you information. We'll also make sure we keep our advisors very current on all of these changes, so you can always reach out to them to get any questions answered. But in the meantime, would welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you, Debbie, for that. We actually have several coming in the Q&A. I will go ahead and start with those questions. Will has asked, How do I handle owner payroll? Our scenario is that the owner has always been receiving payroll from the company as he is an employee and didn't receive any raises this year.
So, and Carrie, and you can help me out with this, but I think what I heard is that the owner is compensated through payroll, and so my thought on that is that it would be handled in the same way as any other payroll calculation for any other employee.
Debbie, I would concur with that answer as well. Another question from Whale reads, the majority of our employees are commission-based, thus don't clock in and out. How do I calculate their FTE number? I was thinking of simply using 0.5. Would this be correct?
That would certainly be the simplest way to do it, and that would be allowed under the SBA rules and requirements.
And Debbie, I would just add to that. I would use the same method as you used on the front part when you were applying for the PPP loan. Keeping consistency from application through forgiveness would be an important tool to utilize as well.
That's a great clarification, Carrie. Thank you.
An additional question from Whale reads, can new employees that were hired during the covered period be included in the forgiveness application?
They can.
Thank you. Geraldine has asked, if there is an employee who couldn't work their full-time hours because of childcare issues during COVID, is there a program that we have to us to use, given we receive the PPP funds, to supply the employee with sick leave hours to make up full-time hours?
Yep, absolutely. So if you are providing them sick leave pay, you can include that in the calculation for that full forgiveness amount.
Thank you. Nancy has asked, I'm interested specifically in forgiveness for sole proprietorships with no employees. What is the maximum forgiveness? As it is being extended to 24 weeks, does that $15,000 amount increase to $46,154? What if we are getting unemployment? Does that impact forgiveness?
Okay, so Carrie, I'm probably going to have you help me with this one a little bit because it was long. And one of the things to note that with the extension period to the 24 weeks is all we know about that today is what is contained in the House bill, which is pretty limited. One of the things that's going to happen is I do expect that the President will sign this within the next few days. Once the President signs it, it's going to take the SBA a little bit of time to kind of process all of these changes, update the instructions, update the application, and then they're going to come out with more guidance to address some of these types of questions, exactly like this one. But otherwise, Carrie, if you want to speak to a couple of those other specifics pertaining to the question that was asked.
Absolutely. The second part of the question was, what if we are getting unemployment? Does that impact forgiveness? At this point, there's been no guidance that says it does impact forgiveness, so you should be able to proceed as directed from Debbie within the slides in this training. Sally has asked, did they increase to 8 weeks to allow for more time to use the money for seasonal businesses as well?
So again, based on the limited amount of information that's contained in the House bill, that is not specifically addressed and is something we're going to need to get more guidance on from the SBA once these actual changes have been approved and enacted. And Carrie, I don't know if your perspective is any different on that.
I would concur with that. We will look for more guidance as more guidance is released.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges that we have, and I wanted to make sure, you know, the guidance just came out, or the Senate just approved this last night, so it's clearly really new information. We're still processing it here at the bank. I wanted to make sure to share it with everyone so you're aware that these changes are coming and to take them into consideration. But as we've been kind of vetting this internally, there's a lot of things that, again, we're going to need some additional clarification on to make sure that we fully understand the intentions behind some of these changes.
Thank you for that, Debbie. The next question comes from Helen. Can you use the alternative time period if you're a bi-monthly payroll employee, meaning 24 pay periods per year?
You can, yeah. And again, you can pick either, based on, assuming that these changes get passed, you will have the option of either using the 8-week covered period. If you want to use that 24-week period, you can do that, and you can include any expenses that were incurred during that 24-week period. Now, if you didn't fully pay them, they can still be counted as long as it's paid within that next payroll period.
Thank you, Debbie. Stu has asked, for the covered period payroll dates, is it the payroll check date or the dates of the pay period?
Oh, I would assume that's a great question. I assume it's the dates of the pay period, but Carrie, what are your thoughts?
I believe there was guidance around that, and I believe it is the pay period date.
Okay, thank you.
Julie has asked, will mileage reimbursement be included under payroll?
I have not seen anything specific to that, so my thought on that is no. One of the things that we have been doing is we're trying to stay very true to the guidance that is being provided from the SBA. So the things that I talked about that can be included from a payroll calculation, those are the only items that the SBA says can be included. So essentially, if you didn't see anything on that list, those are not eligible to be included, and I would put mileage in that category.
Thank you. Andrew has asked, are you able to pay back pay paychecks that were missed before the loan came in?
So I want to make sure I'm understanding it. And so it was, you went back and paid employees that maybe had not been paid or were laid off. Am I understanding that correctly, Carrie?
I'm interpreting that as there was back pay due and owed to the employees that are now being paid.
Yeah, and I think as long as you pay that in the covered period, you can include those expenses.
Thank you. Mark has asked, do utility payments include internet or email services?
So there's not that level of detail provided in the guidance. It's just utility payments. And I don't know, Carrie, if you've seen anything that says if it's specific like electrical payments or if other things are included.
And I actually have not, and we have reached out to our district offices several times with this question, and they don't have any further support to provide at this time. This is something that they would need to, that the applicant would need to make on a determination basis. But again, we've reached out to our district office, and they haven't provided any further guidance as well. Will has a follow-up question. How does receiving an EIDL loan impact the forgiveness amount?
Yeah, so to the extent that you received an EIDL loan and that was used for some of these things that we noted as covered expenses, the SBA will adjust your forgiveness amount by the amount of that loan.
Jessica has asked, are interest payments on a line of credit included in non-payroll forgiveness if it was incurred prior to COVID-19?
So the only thing that's considered a covered expense pertaining to interest payments is for mortgage interest payments. Interest payments on any other type of debt, such as a line of credit, would not be eligible as covered expenses.
Thank you. Scott is looking for clarification. Forgiveness is basically payroll, rent, utilities paid out over a 56-day period, which starts the first pay period following issue date.
Correct, and that would be considered, I think, the alternative covered period, but yes, you are correct in that.
Thank you. Teresa has inquired, I have a 2019 401k safe harbor contribution to make prior to September 15th of 2020. If I make that payment during the 8-week period, will that count as forgivable under the retirement category?
Yeah, and I think we've gotten this question before, Carrie, that you maybe reached out to the district office on, so I don't know if you can provide some insight on that.
We have reached out to the district office, and at this point, they could not provide clarification on the safe harbor piece of it, so I apologize for not being able to follow up on that. Again, any questions that we cannot address today, we will provide further guidance as, or further follow-up as guidance is provided. Brenda has inquired, what about seasonal companies? Full season for us starts April 1st.
Yeah, so one of the things now, you're going to benefit from this extension that's pending with this 24-week period to be able to incur those expenses that would be considered covered.
Scott has asked, if employees take time for schooling for children during COVID, does that apply to reduce an FTE count?
So that's not specifically addressed in there as far as reduced FTE count. And everything that I've seen in the bill, you know, for something like that, there's not good clarity, and we'd need to wait to see if there's additional clarification from the SBA on things like that. Right now I'm thinking no, it would not count, but we can certainly see if there's any additional guidance that comes out on that.
And Debbie, if I could just supplement, I know there was some guidance around that if an employee elects to reduce their the hours and or compensation they are receiving, that would not count against the employer. So that would be something to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, and that's a great clarification. So in that situation, if the employee did choose to reduce, say they worked 40 hours and they elected to reduce their hours to 32 in order to be able to handle some of those child care schooling issues, you're exactly right, Carrie. It does allow for that reduction in FTE to not penalize the calculation.
Robin has inquired, if we have to hire new people due to employees not returning, do they have to be paid the equivalent of what the prior year employees earned?
So that's a great question. In the House bill that was just approved last night, that is not specifically addressed. So we're going to have to wait and see what guidance the SBA comes out on with that. I don't know at this point.
Aaron has asked, for the salary reduction, do you compare against the first quarter of the year? If the pay cycle goes into April, do you include the April pay cycle as well?
So the instructions as it stands today, it needs to be that specific time period of dates. So whatever salary expenses were incurred in that pay period is what you need to look at for making that determination.
Teresa has asked, what if a bonus was paid out between January 1st through March 31st? Will that be counted in the reduction?
So my thought is, I mean, it shouldn't be, and I don't know, Carrie, what your thoughts are if you've seen any guidance on that, because that would throw off that calculation and make it appear like there's a reduction. And really what the SBA wants to understand is, from a core compensation standpoint, that they're not reducing wages. And so you really need to just look at what is that normalized compensation and then compare it during the normalized compensation in that 8-week period, just to ensure that there hasn't been a 25% reduction in salary. So the SBA does say salary. So from that standpoint, I would say no, bonuses wouldn't penalize it.
Thank you. Joe has asked, I'm confused. The covered period is only 8 weeks and the reference period is the entire first quarter, January 1st through March 31st, which is 13 weeks. Is this correct?
It is correct, and that is the way it is laid out today in the application. And so what the SBA does say, though, it's the average weekly payroll. So what you want to do is calculate the average weekly period for that 13-week period and then compare it to the average weekly period in that 8-week period. But you're absolutely correct. There is a different time period. But again, you want to take the averages to determine if there's been that reduction by more than 25%.
Thank you. Doug has asked, for the reduction calculation, we are comparing a 56-day period to a 90-day period. It will likely never meet the 75% test. Can you please confirm that these are the correct numbers for the periods?
Yeah, those are the correct numbers for the periods. And I think that kind of speaks to the question we just had, doesn't it, Carrie?
It does.
Yeah, so again, what you want to look at is the average payroll. So what you do, calculate what that average weekly payroll is. So if your average weekly payroll in that reference period between January and March is $12,000, and then your average weekly payroll in that 8-week reference period is $10,000, you're going to want to make that determination based on that. So it is based on an average weekly payroll.
Robin has an additional question. Is the total insurance premium included in payroll cost?
I'm not sure when we say total insurance premium, but what would be included would be the employer's portion, I think is what she's getting at.
That was my interpretation as well. Thank you. Scott has asked, the 2019 profit sharing contribution does the 2019 profit sharing contribution during this period apply?
And I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding when we say does it apply, but I'm wondering if it has to do with the calculation for forgiveness and the reduction in payroll, and in which case I would say no, because again, we want to look at that average weekly payroll. Some of those additional compensations that might have happened in the first quarter, such as bonuses or profit sharing, would not be included.
Richard has asked, we deferred a rent payment and paid it during the covered period. Can we use all of them?
So I'm not sure when they say deferred or rent payment, if I'm fully understanding what the question is.
So Debbie, Oh, I'm sorry.
What are your thoughts, Carrie?
I can jump in here. We've actually had this question from several applicants, and we have reached out to the district office. We've had several of our borrowers either have their landlords approach them to defer rent payments and or inquire with their landlords whether they could defer rent payments, provided that there's a lease in place prior to February 15th. Even if you've deferred rent payments, you can still go ahead and pay them during the covered period, and they would still be forgivable because they're not a prepaid expense. You are obligated to pay those under your lease agreement. However, you've come into an agreement with your landlord that you have deferred them. So even if you've paid rents that were deferred under contract, you're still obligated to pay those rents. So yes, you can include them in your forgiveness.
Great, thank you.
The next question is the amount paid for health insurance reduced by the portion of EE is paying through payroll deduction? Portion the employer is paying through payroll deduction, excuse me.
So I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm tracking that. Can you maybe clarify the question, Carrie?
I can reread it again. Is the amount paid for health insurance reduced by the portion the employer is paying, the employee is paying through payroll? I'm interpreting that as, can you still deduct the amount of health insurance that the employee is paying for?
Yeah, you cannot. It's only the employer portion.
Julie has asked for wage reduction calculation. If I'm understanding this correctly, we are comparing the 8-week coverage period with a period of January 1st to March 31st.
Yeah, and so, you know, those dates are clearly jumping out to everyone. And when we actually reviewed this internally with our staff, that was one of the first questions we got. And again, it goes back to the fact that we want to take a look at that average weekly payroll to compare that reference period to the covered period.
Robin has asked, are leased items, for instance, forklifts and other equipment that we have made payments on, are they considered covered non-payroll items?
My understanding is that it is only mortgage interest payments that are allowed. So I would say no, those are not allowed.
And we have also followed up with the district office, and I would confirm that as well. Will has asked, is the SBA going to issue a new forgiveness application that includes the new changes, or can we use the existing application?
So we do fully expect that the SBA is going to have to issue a new application as well as a new calculator once these changes are approved by the President. So again, we do have some time here. We are watching this very closely, and as soon as we see that new application come out from the SBA, one of the things that we're doing is we're converting it into an electronic format so that we can send it out to all of you in an electronic format with some of that information pre-filled and then completed. But yes, I do fully expect that we're going to get a new application. So I would say just to kind of wait, and we will notify you as soon as we have that.
Thank you. Robin has asked, if I have used all payroll within 10 weeks, can I apply at that point versus waiting until the full 24 weeks?
Yeah, we talked about this internally, and the guidance does not specifically, the information that's contained in the House bill that we have right now that was just approved last night doesn't specifically address that. But what the bill does say is that you can still use that 8-week covered period. You know, from just a common sense standpoint, my expectation is once you have incurred expenses within a covered period, whether it's 8 weeks or 24 weeks, you can go ahead and apply for forgiveness to get that loan amount forgiven. So my expectation is that, yes, if it's after 10 weeks, you can go ahead and do that, but we do want to make sure we get some clarification from the SBA on that, but that would be my expectation.
Chris is seeking further clarification. It appears that there are several bank lobbyists asking for no need to apply for loan forgiveness for a loan amount that is $150,000 and less. Did that make it into the Senate bill?
It did not. So that is not under consideration. That is not in the current bill that's pending. And we've seen those same articles and those same asks by various groups to have certain loan amounts under, and I've actually seen a few different loan amounts that have been floating out there, just be basically converted to grants, and so there would be no forgiveness application required. But that was not part of the bill that was approved last night and is going to the President. So if that change does happen, it's going to have to be in future legislation. It's currently not pending as of today.
Thank you. Mark has asked, An EIDL loan needs to be noted on the forgiveness application, but does an EIDL grant need to be noted as well?
So the only thing they're going to ask you for is the loan amount and your application number, and then the SBA is going to take a look at that. But it's only the loan that needs to be included, not the grant.
Thank you. Ashley has inquired, you mentioned utility expenses are eligible if incurred and paid in the covered period. Can you confirm that April's bill paid May 6th would not be eligible if disbursement date was May 4th?
So I think what she's asking, if I'm tracking, is if there was expenses that were incurred during that covered period, but they got the bill after the end of the covered period, you can still deduct those expenses that were incurred in the covered period, even though you're not paying them until the next billing cycle. And am I understanding her question correctly, Carrie?
That is how I'm interpreting it as well.
Okay, great.
David has asked, if the basis for the loan amount was 8 weeks of expenses and the basis for the forgiveness amount becomes 24 weeks, wouldn't you assume most PPP money would be totally forgiven because of the extended period?
I do. Yep. And I think that's what Congress is hoping to achieve with this change, is really to do everything that they can do for your businesses to try to help these loans get converted into essentially grants. So I think that is the intent of the extension of the covered period from 8 weeks to 24 weeks.
Thank you. Sue has asked, can we submit supporting schedules, or does everything need to be submitted within the online application?
So our hope would be is that we're going to send this online application out to you, and then we're going to ask you to send it back electronically, and then you can attach any documents that you need. If that method does not work for you, certainly work with your advisors, and we can accept that supporting documentation in whatever format is most convenient for you.
Maria has inquired, I'm an independent contractor and or freelancer. How do I pay myself with a PPP loan? Do I need to set a weekly amount and pay myself that way, or can I just make a lump sum payment to myself and have it forgiven?
So Carrie, I'm thinking, would this cover under the 2019, and then they would need to take basically the 8-week equivalent of what they earned in 2019?
I would concur with that as well, yes, Debbie.
Yeah, so yeah, you're going to want to take a look at what your total earnings were in 2019 and provide that documentation, and then you would take the 8-week equivalent of that.
Next question comes in. If the time period is extended to 24 weeks, will we need to continue with the FTE for that extended time period?
So again, not really great guidance on that yet, and so that's something we're going to watch for from the SBA to better understand how that extension of that 24-week period is going to impact both the FTE calculation as well as the wage reduction calculation. I do expect they'll give us more guidance on that. This is really preliminary. You know, again, the Senate just approved this bill last night, and we're still waiting on it to be approved by the President. So it is not in place as of today, but I do expect once that gets signed by the President, the SBA will start taking a look at that and get us additional clarification.
Another question has come in. Do healthcare premiums include any premiums other than medical insurance, for example, dental and vision?
So I think we had this question before, Carrie, if you want to provide some clarification.
Exactly. So in addition to medical insurance premiums, dental and vision would be included as well.
Thank you.
Michael has asked, will there be someone at Alaris that could help us to fill out these loan forgiveness applications? Also, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Also, how long do we have after receiving the application to complete it and get it back to the bank?
Yeah. So absolutely work with your advisor if you have questions. You know, we're doing a lot of training with them, and we're going to continue to provide them information and updates as these changes come out. So work with them to help you through this process. On the second piece, as far as the time frame, no, you've got plenty of time to fill out that application. As of today, there's no deadline as far as when you need to apply for forgiveness. Now, potentially in the new bill that is pending, that bill would say you need to apply for forgiveness within 10 months after you become eligible. Still, you have lots of time to fill out that application, so don't feel like you need to get it in next day.
Thank you. Sue has inquired, for employees under the $100,000 cap, do you have to submit the detail of each employee, or can it be summed up in one payroll item?
Yeah, so what the SBA is going to be looking for is that sum total. You're just going to want to have documentation for how you arrived at that number.
Thank you, Debbie. Brenda has asked, if on the application the number of employees is more than I have now, is that a determining factor on the forgiveness amount?
So really what the forgiveness amount is going to be based on is that reference period, those 1 to 2 reference periods that you took a look at, as well as your FTE calculation during the covered period. Those are the 2 FTE numbers that are going to determine if it impacts your forgiveness amount.
Nicholas has inquired, our rent payment covers not only rent, but CAM and property taxes. Are all 3 of these covered by the rent forgiveness portion?
I don't know that that's specifically detailed, but I would say that as long as there's an obligated expense under your lease for your space that your business is occupying, yes, you can include those.
Thank you. Brenda has asked, will this recording be available to re-listen to at a later date?
Absolutely, we should be provided to everybody.
Neil has asked a follow-up question in regards to a question we had heard earlier in regards to an EDI loan. Will the amount received for EDI loan or an EID grant reduce the forgivable amount? And I believe, Debbie, you notated that they will take that into consideration as the SBA looks to provide forgiveness on PPP.
Yes, they are. So the SBA wants you to note that if you received a loan, and then they're going to look at that application as far as what that economic disaster loan was for, and then make a determination if that impacts the amount of your forgiveness. So that is a process that the SBA will take a look at.
Jill has asked, can sole proprietors deduct home office expense utilities?
So to the extent that you can deduct it from a tax standpoint, yes, you can include that as a covered expense. And Carrie, is that your perspective as well?
That is my perspective, provided that can be supported by Schedule C. That is my perspective, yes.
Great. Yep. Okay, great.
Becca has asked, we are a nonprofit. We were able to add an independent contractor, i.e. our accountant, onto our initial PPP application under eligible expenses. Can we use an independent contractor payment for eligible expenses for forgiveness?
Oh, really specific. I almost want to think this is a situation we want to check into unless, Carrie, you know specifically how that would be handled.
I would like to confirm, as there's not clear guidance. Initially, we were providing guidance that independent contractors could not be included, but I think with all the changes that are evolving currently in Congress, we would like to provide follow-up on that.
Yeah, so that's a question. You know, reach out to your advisor and check with them, and then we'll coordinate with them and try to get you some good clarity on that.
Erin has asked, how do you calculate an FTE for employees that are paid on a pro rata basis?
So when we're saying pro rata, what are we, so I'm assuming then essentially just maybe help me understand, Carrie, what you think she's asking.
So my interpretation of the question, and I guess the best approach is I would look at that method number 2 where you're providing a half or 0.5 to those employees. It sounds like they're not contributing 40 hours or more a week. So I think the appropriate use of that 0.5 and our method 2 that you talked about earlier in your slide would be most appropriate in this situation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so if it's a full-time 40 hours, it would be the 1. But if you're paying them anything less than that, or I guess I'm not sure I'm fully understanding on the pro rata basis, but yeah, you're right. That might be the best solution for them is to just count those employees as a 0.5 FTE.
Shane has inquired, can you please explain the new 24-week time period once again?
So what Congress has approved that is pending approval by the President is that rather than having only 8 weeks to incur expenses that are basically allow you to have a portion of your loan forgiven, so things like payroll, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities, rather than needing to spend that money in 8 weeks, what Congress is saying is they're going to give you up to 24 weeks to incur those expenses to count towards your forgiveness amount. So going back to one of the questions we had earlier, the expectation is that having that added time frame to incur additional expenses should allow you to have that loan forgiven. And really what Congress is trying to do with this change is for businesses that either due to restrictions imposed by the state prohibiting them to operate, that maybe they've been shut down and they haven't had employees working, it's going to allow them maybe to get those businesses reopened, get those employees back working, and start paying those employees and still have those expenses count towards forgiveness as it pertains to their PPP loan. Because I think Congress just felt like some certain businesses under certain situations need more time to incur those expenses in order to allow them to have their loan forgiven.
Thank you for that, Debbie.
Hi, Debbie. This is Mary. Thank you for that response. I just wanted to interject here for just a moment, as we are over time for what we originally allotted for today's webinar. I appreciate all the questions, and I appreciate you, Debbie, answering them, and Carrie, you facilitating. We will continue for just a few more minutes until about 3:15, continuing to answer questions, but we will be wrapping up. So for those of you still on the call, we encourage you to stay on with us until about 3:15. We'll get through a few more questions. But when we do wrap up, just to reiterate what Debbie said, we will be sending a recording of this to everyone who's on the call, and we will be looking through those questions at the end. But ultimately, if we don't get to your question today due to time, we encourage everyone to reach out to their Alerus advisor to follow up with any specific questions that you may have. So with that being said, I want to turn it back over to Carrie to continue through the queue to answer a few more questions, but just with the note that we will be wrapping up at about 3:15.
Thank you for that. So a few more questions. Patty has inquired, my loan funded on April 24th. I now have everyone back to work this week. Will I just use the June 30th, 2020 date?
So for the FTE calculation, you can certainly do that, although it sounds like you've got the FTEs in place. So maybe, Carrie, I'm not fully understanding the question.
I think my interpretation of the question is, instead of waiting until the end of the year, now that Patty has restored all those FTEs and there would not be a potential for a reduction, should she just move forward and utilize that June 30th date versus waiting until the December 31st date?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, to the extent that you have, you know, sufficient expenses during this 8-week covered period, that you're not going to be penalized from either salary reduction or an FTE reduction, I would say as soon as we get this new application from the SBA and get that out to everyone, go ahead and apply.
Thank you for that. Sean has inquired, how about an owner who takes out a regular distribution while all other employees are paid on a regular W-2 basis?
Yeah, so I know this question came up a lot during the first phase as far as calculating, and my understanding, Carrie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but distributions do not count toward that compensation calculation, either for the originally for determining the loan amount and now for determining the forgiveness amount.
That is correct. And Sean, I just want to follow up. If you are a general partner, there are other rules that are applicable to you that you can utilize your K-1 schedules for. So just please keep in mind that if you are a general partner of a partnership, distributions wouldn't be allowable. However, you can use that alternative K-1 information in place of that. Chris has inquired, yesterday Forbes announced that bankers around the country are lobbying to have all PPP loans less than $150,000 forgiven due to the complexity of SBA requirements. Do you have any knowledge of this new development? And I know, Debbie, you had addressed that it was not included in the current bill in Congress, but do we have any other developments or have we heard anything else further on that?
We haven't, and I think I read that same Forbes article, and you know, I can tell you from a bank standpoint, it would be great. I mean, we would hugely appreciate if they did that because I think it saves a lot of work not only for our clients, but it also helps us a lot on the processing side. But right now, it is, you know, while the ask is out there, it is not part of this current bill. And just based on Congress, I think the House is on recess right now and isn't due to come back until the end of June. I don't expect to see anything on this anytime soon. So we're going to have to continue to move ahead with the rules as we understand them to be today.
John has inquired, if you already applied with another bank, but they are slow to respond, can I apply with Alerus?
So I think what he's asking for is, can you still get a PPP loan? And you can, absolutely. You know, the last I saw is there's still about $130 billion in funds left that can be allocated. And so if you have not gotten a response or been able to obtain a PPP loan, absolutely reach out. We can connect you with an advisor and see if we can help you out with that.
Thank you for that. Randy has asked, I'm assuming that payroll accrued but not yet paid is not eligible.
So that's correct, unless it's paid within that next payroll period. So if you incurred the expense and you just, it wasn't captured in the last payroll in that covered period, you can still pick that expense up as long as it's paid by that next payroll date.
Thank you. Tom has inquired, I believe Minnesota considers an FTE at 30 hours per week. Could we use that? Does this come into play with this calculation if we are a Minnesota resident?
Unfortunately, it does not. And I recognize that there are different rules out there as far as what constitutes a full-time equivalent employee. And I've seen different numbers. I know a lot of times 36 hours is used, but from the SBA's perspectives and for this purposes, the SBA has chosen to use 40 hours, which is what you need to use for your calculation right now.
Thank you. I have a clarifying question to an answer that was given earlier. If someone met the maximum payroll cost of $15,385, is it true that we cannot include employer health care contributions for that employee?
That is correct, I believe. I'm understanding the question correctly. Carrie, maybe I'm not.
So I'm interpreting that a little bit differently. So your payroll is strictly just the payroll that you're receiving. You can include any types of benefits above that $100,000 maximum cap, provided that it's actually not payroll going to the client. That's how I'm interpreting the question.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think the exception we maybe talked about is if it's an owner compensation. There are some different, for certain sole proprietorships and general partners, there's some different rules in place for that.
Yes, Lavina, if you would like to follow up with a clarifying question and or reach out to your advisor depending on your specific situation, I would recommend that. An additional question reads, where do you enter taxes and group health?
So I'm not sure when we say enter. I'm thinking she's thinking maybe the application. Is that what you're thinking, Carrie?
I'm interpreting that the question is regarding the application, correct?
Yeah, and so we would want to, I'd need to go back and take a look at the application. I'm not sure I can cite a specific line item. I don't, unfortunately, have an application in front of me right now. I don't know if you know off the top of your head, Carrie.
I don't, and with the updated, with updates coming based on the new guidance to the application, we would look to that new application for reference, I think. Stephen,
Carrie and Debbie. Oh, Carrie and Debbie, thanks so much. This is Mary again. We are at our 3:15 mark, so I did want to interject and just mention again to folks that we will be wrapping up the session. And again, if you have specific questions, please reach out to your Alaris advisor with those specific questions, as we are providing additional training to them over the next several days. I want to thank Debbie so much for today's presentation. It's a wealth of information, Debbie, so thank you for putting that together and sharing all of that, and Carrie for helping to facilitate. Carrie, Debbie, any final thoughts as we wrap up?
No, again, just thank you all for joining us today and having so many questions and being so engaged in this process. Again, I know that there's just a lot of questions that are out there, and while we haven't been able to necessarily answer all of them today, rest assured, you know, we're going to continue to monitor. We'll get all of the information, and we will work with you on making sure we help you through this entire process.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. Again, just as a final reminder, we will be sending out this recording via email to everyone that has attended today, so you can go back and review. And if you have any, like I said, any additional questions or specific questions, please reach out to your Alaris advisor. Thank you again for taking the time today to join us for this very important presentation. Have a great afternoon. Bye now.